So hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Really been blown away by the response to this event. I'm Alice. For those of you who don't know, I'm the founder of the Lowdown, which is a website that can help you sort out your contraception. We've collected over 4,500 reviews on every method and brand of contraception available in the UK. We have a consultation service where you can book in to speak to a really expert women's health doctor. And we've recently launched our prescription service. So you can get the pill delivered to your door without having to have a doctor's appointment. So yeah, I set up the Lowdown to help women navigate the minefield that is contraception. And if you haven't seen our website, do check out the lowdown.com. One thing that loads of our users tell us about is problems that they have around PCOS. So this was really high up on our list of things to cover in an event, and it turns out I think something like 7% of it's the most common endocrine and reproductive disorder and affects over 7% of the female population worldwide, but Colin will probably correct me on that stat soon. So yeah, I've invited Professor Colin Duncan, who's one of the world's leading experts, to come and talk to us about PCOS. He is he's Professor of Reproductive Medicine and Science at the University of Edinburgh, and has been studying how the ovary works in health and disease for many, many years. So we're going to cover what PCOS is, what causes it, what treats it, where you guys can get help if you've got it or understand if you have got it. Colin's going to present for about 20-25 minutes. I'll chip in with questions in the way I normally do, and please please add stuff to the chat as he's presenting so we can clarify things if things aren't clear. And then we'll open for a Q&A at the end where I'll try and facilitate based on questions that you guys can put in the chat. So yeah, without further ado, I'll let Colin take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much for asking me to speak, and hopefully what we'll talk about today will be interesting. So I'm from Edinburgh, and here's a nice picture of Edinburgh, and you can see the castle, Edinburgh Castle. But if you go about 4 miles south east of that castle, you find another castle, and that's called Craigmillar Castle. And just in the grounds below Craigmillar Castle, and you can see it from the castle ramparts here, this is the hospital that I work on, which is the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. And today I'm going to talk about polycystic ovary syndrome, because what I do is I run a clinic for women with hormone problems. And when it comes down to sort of hormone problems, the most common problem that comes to see me is women with irregular menstrual periods. So their periods are not coming very frequently, and when they do come, they tend to be very long and prolonged. And so if somebody comes to see me with a period problem because of a lack of periods or very infrequent periods, then what I'll do is that I'll say to them, I'll say, the womb doesn't have periods because it feels like it. The womb has to be told to have periods, and it's told to have periods by hormones that come from the ovary. And the ovary will send hormones to the womb to tell it to grow a lining, get rid of it, grow a lining, get rid of it. And it does that when it grows and releases eggs. So when you're having very irregular periods, it tends to mean that your ovary isn't growing and releasing eggs regularly. And the ovary doesn't grow and release eggs because it feels like it. It needs to be told. And it's told by a couple of hormones that come down from the brain and say to the ovary, grow an egg, release an egg, grow an egg and release an egg. And that means that if you're not growing and releasing eggs and you've got erratic periods, there's only really 3 reasons why that might happen. Reason number 1 is if the ovary is running out of eggs. So if the ovary is running out of eggs, then some months the ovary can't find any suitable eggs. And what that means is the ovary will not find an egg to grow that month, and therefore there won't be that period. And in polycystic ovary syndrome, there's plenty of eggs in the ovary, and therefore I'll say, and that is definitely not the case with you. The second cause is if the signals from the brain to the ovary to tell the ovary what to do are low. And what that means is the ovary is not being told what to do, so it doesn't do anything. It just sits there and doesn't do anything. And what I'll see in polycystic ovary syndrome is that I'll say, and that's not you either, because we've measured your signals and they are there. And what you have is the third reason. And the third reason is that the signals that come from, that tell the ovary what to do, are a bit out of balance. And because these signals are a bit out of balance, the ovary gets mixed messages and it gets confused. So what happens is the ovary gets confused, and what it does is it starts to grow an egg, doesn't know what to do, doesn't get the right signals to tell it what to do, so therefore it pauses the egg. Starts to grow an egg, pauses an egg. Starts to grow an egg, pauses an egg. Starts to grow an egg. Sometimes it'll release it, but a lot of the times it pauses the egg. And if you look at the ovary, say on a scan, you can see little dots in the ovary. And these little dots are little paused eggs. And actually, the one thing about polycystic ovary is that polycystic ovary has got no cysts on it. What a polycystic ovary does is it has some paused eggs on it because the eggs have paused because they didn't know what to do because they were getting the wrong signals to tell them what to do. So they've just stayed there in a bit of suspended animation. And therefore, there are no cysts on the ovary in polycystic ovary. And one thing to think about is actually how big is a polycystic ovary? Because some women that I speak to sort of feel that the ovary is a bit like a cauliflower or something inside them. So I want you to think of it for a second. How big is a polycystic ovary? Do you think it's a bit bigger than a hen's egg or a bit smaller than a hen's egg? So have a think about that and then think, is it bigger or smaller?
I'm going to guess smaller.
Okay, the answer is you're absolutely right, it is smaller. And so these are medjool dates, and so if you go into the supermarkets, some of the posher supermarkets, you'll see these medjool dates, and that's about the size of a polycystic ovary. And actually, I think sometimes people feel that their ovaries are much bigger than they actually are. And these little dots in the ovary, these little tiny little dots, are only about 4 millimeters in size, these little paused follicles, which we called cysts. Because when we called polycystic ovaries, we didn't realize they were paused eggs, and we called them cysts.
So is that why it's called PCOS? And that's really misleading because there aren't cysts. It's actually like paused egg syndrome, not polycystic.
Yes, or these little eggs are called follicles. And what you're looking at is the follicles. So you should probably call it polyfollicular ovary rather than polycystic ovary, because a cyst is an abnormal structure in the ovary that doesn't have an egg in it. But each of these little paused eggs are actually got, these little follicles have a little paused egg in it. And that paused egg is still sitting there. So it's actually relatively healthy. And we'll talk about the health of it in a second.
Can I just ask, are all ovaries that size or just polycystic ones?
Okay, so the polycystic ovaries are just slightly bigger than a normal. So if you measure the size of a polycystic ovary, it might be about 3 centimeters in length, whereas a normal ovary might be about 2.5 centimeters in length. So there's not a big difference in the size of them. But what there is a difference is what they look like, because here's a polycystic ovary on the right-hand side and a normal ovary on the left-hand side. And you can see the dots in the left-hand side, but the polycystic ovary has got smaller dots and a lot more of them. And this is a scan, and we can scan the ovary and look at it. And what happens is that if you look at the ovary and you count more than 12 of these little dots and a section through the ovary, that's what's called a polycystic ovary. You can see that this woman doesn't have a polycystic ovary, and this is a polycystic ovary. So I've got another question for you, I suppose. If you were to go down to your local high street and take 100 women of reproductive age, how many of those women would have polycystic ovaries on an ultrasound scan? So if you were to go down and just scan everyone's ovaries, how many of them would you say, that's a polycystic ovary? That's got an increased number of these little paused eggs in it. Do you think it's less than 10%, more than 10%?
We've got a mixture of responses, more than, oh no. Yeah, most are saying more than 10%. I'm going to say less than 10%.
Yeah. So actually, if you look at it, it's 20%. So what that means is that 1 in 5 women are on the spectrum of polycystic ovary syndrome. Because polycystic ovary syndrome is not just polycystic ovaries, there's other things. So when it comes down to the diagnosis of polycystic ovary syndrome, then there's 3 things that the doctor takes into consideration. The first thing is whether or not the ovary looks polycystic on the scan. And that can be hard to tell because not all of the people that are doing the scans are able to sort of fully classify an ovary as polycystic or not. So you've got the polycystic ovary in the scan, you've got your irregular periods, and the other feature is increase of male type hormones. We know that these little dots in the ovary, the little paused eggs, are actually quite healthy. And what they do is they produce a little bit extra male type hormone because male type hormone is common in the very small eggs. And when they get a bit bigger, they produce more and more of the female type hormone. So if you've got polycystic ovary syndrome, you tend to have a little bit extra of the male type hormone. And so what happens is male type hormone is good, can make you feel good, it can make you feel frisky, but it can have adverse effects on your skin by causing spots or perhaps some extra hair. But the male type hormone levels, you might be thinking of, instead of it being 1.5, it might be 2, whereas male levels might be 15. Okay, so what happens is that you've got the increased male type hormones or the symptoms of increased hormones, the polycystic ovary, the irregular periods where eggs are not growing and releasing regularly, and you have to have these together to have polycystic ovary syndrome. It's a little bit confusing because the doctors only really need to have 2 out of those 3. And that's useful because it means you can make the diagnosis of polycystic ovary syndrome without having the scan. Because if you've got the irregular periods, a slight increase in male type hormones, and there isn't anything else going on, they can make the diagnosis without doing the scan. Likewise, they can make the diagnosis by looking at the scan and the period history without necessarily measuring the male type hormones. So 2 out of 3 will work for these. And therefore, if 1 in 5 women are on the spectrum, the next question is an easy question because Alice has already told you the answer to start off with right at the beginning. So how many women have actually polycystic ovary syndrome? That's just more than just having the polycystic ovaries, and that is about 1/3 of the women with polycystic ovaries have polycystic ovary syndrome. So probably up to about 8% of women have got sort of polycystic ovary syndrome. Okay, now there are some things that make women with polycystic ovaries be more likely to have polycystic ovary syndrome. And one of those things are things that exaggerate that hormone imbalance. And that hormone imbalance can be exaggerated by weight. So your periods might be quite regular and everything going well, but with a bit of weight gain, then sometimes the little bit of hormone imbalance that's there, that's causing the polycystic ovary, but not affecting the growing and releasing of eggs, can mean that with a bit of weight, then you end up getting that polycystic ovary syndrome. And there's another thing that can cause that, and that is insulin. And insulin is the hormone of storage. And if insulin is higher in some people, then what you'll find is it as well is an exaggerator of that. And if you become something called insulin resistant, which is pre-diabetic or having issues with dealing with your glucose, your ovary will end up becoming a little bit more polycystic. So there are things that can exaggerate it. Weight exaggerates and insulin exaggerates. And obviously, these are the more metabolic things. And the interesting thing is that women with polycystic ovary syndrome, as well as having a hormone imbalance, they have a metabolic imbalance. And metabolic is how you deal with food. And if you look at women with polycystic ovary syndrome, a lot of women with polycystic ovary syndrome complain of weight problems, difficulty in losing weight, or problems in putting on extra weight. Now, I'm from the 3rd fattest country in the world, which is Scotland, but the first fattest is America. And I wonder if anyone can guess what the second fattest country in the world is, because I don't think you'll manage to guess that just at the moment.
UK, I've got Canada.
It's actually Australia, which is, so if you look at the states in Australia, up to sort of 2/3 of women with polycystic ovary syndrome are actually sort of, obese. And so it does mean that there are weight issues in polycystic ovary syndrome. And as we know, as you put on weight, polycystic ovary syndrome gets worse. And because there's a metabolic imbalance that makes weight problems more likely, you can see how that could be this vicious cycle. Now, when it comes
can I ask, Colin, just on that, so we've gone through like the 3 things you need to have to actually be diagnosed with the syndrome, and then the things that exaggerate it, weight and insulin. Is it that metabolic problems are the cause, or the do you always have a weight problem if you've got PCOS, or is it?
What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about weight issues. I mean, I think that what we know is that we know that PCOS makes metabolic problems a little bit worse. Metabolic problems make PCOS, people think about hormone problems a bit worse, and they're linked together. And actually, I don't think that one causes the other. I think they've probably both got this common cause that manifests itself in these ways. But when it comes down to sort of weight, then I'm just going to explain a little bit about weight. So when it comes down to weight, you have to think of what makes you gain weight. Well, it's a simple equation. If you take in too much, you gain weight. If you expend too little energy, you'll gain weight. So there's a balance, and that's your energy balance. And if you take in the same amount of calories as you burn off, then what that means is that your weight stays the same. If you take in too many calories or don't burn off enough, your weight will go up. And if you eat less and take in less calories or expend more, your weight will go down. So I want to just look at energy expenditure. And this is the energy expenditure of a normal human being. And this yellow block here is the amount of energy you spend by being physically active. And that's about 25% of the energy you spend. So the energy you spend exercising and being physically active, unless you're an elite athlete, is about 25% of the energy you expend over the course of the day. 65% of that energy, most of your energy that you expend, is spent by staying alive. Okay, that's your heart beating, your blood pumping around your body, your liver doing what your liver does, your kidneys doing what your kidneys do. Okay, and then there's what's left. And that 15% of energy expenditure is what's called adaptive energy expenditure. It means that it's your ability to burn off calories. And the way that you do this is if you eat an awful lot, you tend to burn off calories, and that means you get hotter. And maybe if you have a feast, whether it's Christmas or Eid Mubarak or something along those lines, you will sometimes notice that you feel hot and sweaty after eating. And that's because if you eat a lot, then you end up burning off these extra calories. And that's called adaptive energy expenditure, or the fancy term of it is postprandial thermogenesis. And that means that after you eat, you burn off some of the calories you've eaten rather than store them. Okay? Now, if you look at women with PCOS, then women with PCOS are in these white squares here, and control women are here in the dark squares. And this is just the amount you burn off after eating. And what you can see is that women with PCOS don't burn off as much when they're given exactly the same amount of food. And this is, and what you can see is that they burn off about 3/4 of what a woman without PCOS would burn off. And that doesn't matter whether you're overweight or slim, it's exactly the same whether you've got PCOS compared to weight matched controls. So what that means is, it means that women with PCOS have got a little deficit here. So they have to eat every single day 4% less food to be the same as anybody else, or they have to exercise 20% more to be the same as anybody else. And a lot of women with PCOS manage that. They understand that, they do that. But if they don't, and they have to work so much harder to keep their weight stable, what you'll find is that gradually weight will creep on because their metabolism isn't the same. And when people say, oh, anyone can lose weight, or I can lose weight, why can't you? It's because it's not to do with how much you eat and how much you exercise. It's the fact you have to eat less and exercise more just to be the same as anybody else. Okay? So, yeah, as I said, you have to eat less or exercise more. So that means that women with PCOS do have a higher level of the hormone storage. And that means that they do find it easier to gain weight and a bit more difficult to lose weight. Why did that happen? Why have we got women who can have a condition that might make them struggle with their weight? Well, if it turns out that there's a famine or a real problem, then the women with a very high metabolism will die off. And it's the women who have got the efficient metabolism, that don't burn off the calories to the same extent, that tend to survive and repopulate the planet. So I think that's why it's so common, because of previous generations where food was a lot scarcer. When patients come to see me in the clinic with PCOS, they've got some worries. The first worry they have is about their fertility. The second biggest worry they have is about their weight. And the third biggest worry is about some of the symptoms that they're having. So when it comes down to fertility, I think that that's a very straightforward thing to say to patients about fertility. What I will say to a woman who comes to see me and is worried about the fertility, I'll say that every now and then you will grow and release an egg, but you might not get the warning as to when that might happen. And that means that if you don't want to achieve a pregnancy, you definitely need to use contraception, because you can guarantee that if you're not using contraception, that will be and you don't want to get pregnant, that will be the one time that the ovary grows and releases eggs. And you can't use the natural family planning methods in polycystic ovary syndrome because the eggs are released in an irregular manner. So I'll say that fertility may well happen out of the blue, and it's important to remember that. Interestingly, women with PCOS, their fertility gradually increases with age. And actually, sometimes in their later 30s, they're more fertile than they were in the later 20s, because that hormone imbalance gets a little bit better with age. When it comes down to fertility, I am very, very good at making women with PCOS release eggs, to the extent that I will, whether it's through tablets or injections, I will always get somebody with polycystic ovary syndrome to grow and release eggs normally. So I can return fertility to normal for that couple. That doesn't mean to say there isn't any other problem in that couple, but I can definitely return to fertility to normal. And the biggest impact is that women with PCOS might not have the luxury of, with their partner, saying, well, if it happens, it happens, or should we definitely try? Because women with PCOS can come to the doctor without having to try for a year before they come to the fertility specialist. They can come straight away if they want to. Now, one of the things that women with PCOS will often be on is the pill, and we'll talk about that in a second. And when you're on the pill, the hormones that are telling the ovary what to do are switched off. And what that means is, it means that when you stop the pill, the hormones switch back on again. But sometimes they take a little time to get out of balance. And so women with polycystic ovary syndrome will often release an egg as soon as they stop being on the pill. And actually, they have a bit of enhanced fertility after stopping the pill. And sometimes if you think, oh, I might have issues in getting pregnant in the future, as soon as they stop the pill, they may fall pregnant straight away. And it's important to remember that. One of the biggest issues, however, is when it comes down to fertility treatments, there are weight issues. There are weight limits to fertility treatment. When it comes down to IVF, there's weight limits. When it comes down for using medication, there are weight limits. And so if a woman with PCOS has got real problems with her weight, and is very obese, with a BMI of say over 35, then we would say lose weight before fertility treatment, and therefore weight issues become more important when it comes down to fertility. When it comes down to symptoms, then some of the symptoms are lack of periods, and it's very easy to give somebody periods every month by using hormones. And people can be on the pill and it will give them a regular cycle, even though it's false periods, it's still periods that are coming every month. And so when somebody is on the pill with polycystic ovary syndrome, their hormones are an awful lot better because the ovaries are switched off. And therefore that means that their spots can get a bit better. There are any extra facial hair, for instance, can get a bit better. Sometimes it doesn't switch them off to the same extent, and you need to use additional hormones like male hormone blocking hormones to help the skin. But we've got treatments to sort of help some of the symptoms, but they tend to be hormone based. When it comes down to being on the pill, do you mask polycystic ovary syndrome? Well, you mask some of the features because it might be that the male hormone levels are a lot less. It might be that your period, you can't tell whether there's irregular periods or not, so it can mask them, but it will not mask the metabolic parts of polycystic ovary syndrome. So when it comes down to treating the symptoms, then sometimes the symptoms get treated very well with the pill or other hormones or hormones to give you periods. If somebody doesn't want to be on the pill, they have to take hormones every 3 months to give them a period, because the womb likes to have a period about 3 or 4 times a year just to keep healthy. And if the womb doesn't have periods for a long time, it can get a bit out of control and develop abnormal cells in the inside of the womb. So it's important to have a period every 3 or 4 months, regardless of what other treatment's being used. Unless, of course, you're on a type of contraception that gives you no periods at all. When it comes down to weight, I think weight is the biggest issue. And the one thing that I'm very bad at doing is helping women lose weight. We know that weight loss is really, really beneficial. And now I just want to talk about a study that was done in Australia, and it was called the Fertility Fitness Program. And what they did was they looked at women who were wanting to achieve a pregnancy, got them to come into the clinic, had weekly meetings with them, gave them lectures about nutrition, gave them exercises, and did that for 6 months. And I just want to highlight a couple of things. The first thing to say is that when they did that, some patients completed it for 6 months and other patients dropped out. And roughly about half of the people completed it and half of the people dropped out. What you can see is that their BMI was over 35 on average, and they had about a similar length of time for fertility. The people that completed it tended to lose about 10 kilograms. And actually, that meant that they were still obese. So they hadn't gone into the overweight, but they lost 10 kilograms. And of those women that completed it, 90% of them started releasing eggs by themselves. And all of them had a BMI over 30. And nobody that dropped out released any eggs. And what you can see is when it comes down to fertility, it made a big difference. But as well as fertility, it made a differences on how well they were feeling, the self-esteem. And I think that weight loss is a phenomenally good effect in polycystic ovary syndrome. But as we know, it's very, very difficult to do. So how can we help weight loss in polycystic ovary syndrome? And I wish I had a magic tablet that would help weight loss, but unfortunately, I don't. But there are some rules. And the first rule is that if you skip a meal, then the next time you eat, you will store more of that food because your body goes into starvation mode quicker. So if you skip a meal, it's unlikely you'll lose weight because you store more the next time you eat. So you have to eat small meals regularly. These meals need to be healthy and try to avoid the refined carbohydrates, the sugary things, you know, the cakes, the biscuits, the sugar. And there's sugar in quite a lot of things like white bread, an example that you might not realize. So when it comes down to to diet regular small meals and avoiding the sugary things. Now, most people will have a small breakfast, a medium-sized lunch, and a bigger dinner at night. And when polycystic ovary syndrome, it works better the other way around. A big breakfast, a medium-sized dinner, and a medium-sized lunch, and a small dinner at night. And that's because what you want to do is front load the calories so that you can burn them off during the day. The worst thing you can do is eat late at night and not do any physical activity after that, because all that calories will just be stored, okay? So ideally not eating after 7 o'clock at night. And then I say to the patients, when you do that and you're reducing your calorific intake, your body will try to slow down and try not to lose weight. So what you have to do is speed it up, and you speed it up by doing physical activity. And some doctors, when people are trying to lose weight, will say to the patient, don't go and do physical activity. That's not me. I would say physical activity is a good thing. But the reason that some doctors say don't do physical activity is because if you're trying to lose weight and you're very active and you do a 5-mile walk or do something, go swimming or something, then you're very pleased. And one of the things that women do is reward themselves. And depressingly, the reward is actually more calories usually than has been lost by the physical activity. So the secret is physical activity without that, dietary reward. Okay. So one of the things that is critical is what causes PCOS. And I don't know that I'm going to be able to tell you the answer to that, but it is something that you're born with. It is something you're born with, and you'll always have to one degree or another throughout your life. Okay? Now, sometimes it's more obvious than other times, depending on the weight, depending on the age, but it's something you're born with and will always have. Okay? And these conditions tend to be genetic. And there's no doubt about it that polycystic ovaries does run in families. And when you're doing genetics, it's very hard because ideally you want to find out what the male equivalent of polycystic ovary syndrome is, because then you can look at family trees. And we don't know what the male equivalent of polycystic ovary syndrome is, because obviously we can't look at their ovaries, we don't know anything about their periods, but it has been suggested that the male equivalent might be premature balding, okay? But we don't know that for sure. But what they've done is they've taken women with polycystic ovary syndrome, women without polycystic ovary syndrome, taken their DNA and looked at it in great deal of detail. And to cut a long story short, there's been a lot of genes that they've thought about and said this might be the cause, and then they've tested again, it's not. And actually, most of the time they hit a brick wall. There are some genes that are common in polycystic ovary syndrome, and it might explain a tiny number of cases. But overall, we have spent a lot of money looking for the genetics of it and haven't managed to find any genetic clues. So what I want to do is tell you another clue, which is maybe of interest, and that is an experiment that was done in the 70s. And in the 70s, there was a lot of questioning about maleness and femaleness. And what the questions that they were asking don't make sense to us today, but they were thinking that the reason baby boys are a bit boisterous and different from baby girls is because we treat them differently. We give baby girls little dolls to play with, and we give baby boys rough and tumble things to play with. And because we treat them that way, that is what gives them their maleness or their femaleness. And that was a big debate about that. And therefore, what happened was that they did some studies to try to investigate that. And they couldn't test it in rats because rats don't treat baby boys differently from baby girls. So what they did was they tested some monkeys. So the monkeys do treat sort of boy monkeys differently, and boy monkeys behave differently from girl monkeys. And what they did was they gave the mother a little bit extra male type hormone before while she was pregnant. And when the babies were born, they looked like females and had a little bit of, boisterousness and behaved a little bit male-like, even although they looked like girls and they were treated like girls. And what the researchers discovered, something very obvious, is that the hormones before you're born very much program your body, and it's nothing to do with how you're treated afterwards. And what happened was, if these were rats that were being studied, they would have been sacrificed. But these are monkeys, and they're healthy monkeys. And so what they did was that they get retired to a monkey sanctuary. And 25 years later, somebody was looking at these monkeys and realized that these monkeys, who were born to a mother who had a little bit extra male type hormone in pregnancy, had the hormone imbalance, polycystic ovaries, increased male type hormone, irregular periods, problems with their weight, and higher levels of insulin. And if these monkeys had come to see me, I'd make the diagnosis of polycystic ovary syndrome. And so there was no genetic elements at all in these monkeys, because their mother was absolutely normal. It is interesting that women with polycystic ovary syndrome tend to have a little bit higher male type hormone during pregnancy. And the question is polycystic ovary syndrome dependent on the exposure of male type hormone in women before they're born? And we don't know the answer to that, but there's some evidence that perhaps it might be programmed before you're born, and maybe male hormones have got something to do with that. How much of that is genetic, how much of it's environmental, it's difficult to do. So I want to finish by just talking about some of the research that I've just done, because what I've done is that I've tried to use sheep to help women with polycystic ovary syndrome. And what I've done is I've done exactly what they did to the monkeys, to the sheep. I've given the pregnant sheep a little bit extra male type hormone, and then when the lamb was born, I just see what happened to that lamb is it grew into an adult sheep. And what happened was, interestingly, because that adult sheep got the hormone imbalance, the polycystic ovaries, the irregular ovulation. Sheep don't have periods, but it had irregular ovulation, it had higher levels of insulin. And what it did was it gained weight. You can see that at birth it was fine, and as the sheep get older and they go through puberty, after around about puberty, then they started gaining weight. And so these sheep who get the same diet as everybody else, they did the same amount of activity as the other sheep, but they were gaining weight. And that was because of something that had happened before they were born. And actually what I did was I looked at their ability to burn calories after eating, and it was exactly the same as we see in women with polycystic ovary syndrome. And interestingly, if you look at the difference, it was pretty much exactly the same as we see in women with PCOS. So I spent a lot of time working out what the problem was, because I could spend a lot of time doing tests sort of on the sheep to sort of work out what the issue was. And I'm not going to go into that in any detail, but suffice to say is that what we discovered was that when the sheep eat, when they eat, the brain senses that they've eaten, and it signals through insulin to tell the body through the fat to burn off the calories. And if they had PCOS, when they ate, there wasn't that same insulin signaling, and therefore they didn't realize they'd eaten and they didn't burn off the calories. And what we decided was that the way forward was to try to increase the insulin signaling in the brain. And if you put something up the nose, then it manages to get into the brain through nerves just at the very top of the nose. And we did that, and we increased the amount of calories that things were burnt off. And so this is just, when I presented this at a scientific meeting, the New Scientist magazine was there, and they managed to report it. And what I'm just about to hopefully start is testing this in women to see if there's a way of helping women with polycystic ovary syndrome normalize their response to food and weight. So it's still very, very early days, but that's some of the new research that I've been doing that hopefully will be very beneficial, because as I said, the thing which women with polycystic ovary syndrome struggle most with is weight. When it comes down to information, you can go to the NHS website and look up polycystic ovary syndrome. There's a charity called Verity, which is a really good for supporting patients with polycystic ovary syndrome. This reference here, it's a paper that I wrote, and it's a little bit complicated, but it's how I explain polycystic ovary syndrome to medical students. So some people might like to read that. Hopefully it's inaccessible. And for people that are interested, this is another paper here. And this paper here is just talking to women with polycystic ovary syndrome and just finding out what their issues are and what the concerns that they've got, and highlighting to women with polycystic ovary syndrome that there's a lot of people out there with the same issues as they have. So really that's all I wanted to say, and hopefully it's been useful, and hopefully there's been some questions that people might want to ask, and I can answer any questions that people have got.
Colin, that was absolutely fascinating. I just have to say thank you. The slides were really good. You whipped through a lot, but it was really clear and so interesting. So thank you so much. I'm going to focus in on like the topic areas of weight and fertility in a bit, but before we do, let's go right back to the start when you talked about the diagnosis. So we talked about the fact that 1 in 5 women have the paused egg thing. Is that right?
Yeah. So if you look at the ovaries on a scan, 1 in 5, and so you'll get these women who somebody does a scan them and says, you've got polycystic ovaries, and they say, no, but my periods are fine, my skin's fine, I don't have anything like that. So you can have polycystic ovaries without polycystic ovary syndrome, even although I don't like the term polycystic.
Yeah, even though it's a silly name. So you can have PO without the PCOS.
Yeah. So you have PCO and not PCOS.
Okay, so to get diagnosed as having the full syndrome, what tests or things do you need to ask for?
Okay, so what I said earlier was you don't necessarily need to have a scan, okay? Because the diagnosis can be made without a scan. Most of the time, what they might want to do is measure hormones in the blood sample and look at what's happening with the periods. When it comes down to measuring hormones in a blood sample, the best time to do it is during a period, but sometimes people don't have predictable periods to be able to get a blood sample arranged at that time. So it can be done at any time. So most of the time they're doing the blood sample and you're looking at the hormones that are telling the ovary what to do. You're looking for other causes of irregular periods, but you're mainly looking at the male type hormones, okay? And so male type hormones can sometimes be normal, but increased. Well, that's an interesting concept. So if you measure them, they might be normal. And so what happens is there's a sponge in the blood that mops up the male type hormone, okay? And if that sponge is lower, then your hormones might be the same level, but they're not being mopped up, okay? And that sponge relates to being weight. So what you can actually do is measure something called the free androgens. And the free androgens is the free testosterone. It means it's the testosterone that's not been mopped up by that sponge in the blood.
Just on weight, quite a few women in the chat talking about bloating. Is there any evidence that that's related to the weight gain? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when it comes down to sort of weight gain, then I think that bloating is a transient weight gain. But what we're talking about is over time putting on extra sort of extra fat. But what happens is that the one hormone that women with polycystic ovary syndrome are deficient in is progesterone. And progesterone is the hormone that happens once you've released an egg. And interestingly, some people say, I feel bloated before my period. And you'd think, oh, well, if you don't have that hormone that's before your period, you might feel less bloated. But actually, one of the big hormones that causes bloating is estrogen. And women with polycystic ovary syndrome don't just have 2 weeks of estrogen that then gets cancelled out with the progesterone. They can have months of estrogen. And sometimes women themselves say, I really, really need to have a period.
Yeah.
Because I feel really bloated. And sometimes when they have a period, then the bloating disappears. and the bloating largely is fluid retention rather than, than anything else. So yes, it can gain weight, but that weight is a more transient one that might disappear after a period.
Wow, that's so interesting. Because is there any evidence that the ability to lose that weight or keep at a good weight is harder as you get older with women who have PCOS?
Well, as you get older, particularly if you get weight problems, you're more likely to have slightly higher levels of insulin. And therefore, insulin is a hormone of storage, so it can become a little bit harder as you become more insulin. And we know that women with polycystic ovary syndrome are more likely to get diabetes in later life. Okay, but actually, and some people say, "Oh my goodness, that's horrible." I've read all the horrible things that can happen in polycystic ovary syndrome. I've heard about problems of the inside of the womb. I've heard about diabetes. I've heard about all these horrible things that can happen in polycystic ovary syndrome. And what is important to remember is that if you've got polycystic ovary syndrome, the chances of diabetes and all these things, horrible things are happening to it, are not much higher than the general population, and they're a lot less than women who don't have polycystic ovary syndrome that are obese. Okay, so obesity is much worse than polycystic ovary syndrome. But if you've got polycystic ovary syndrome and obesity, it's a bit worse than obesity by itself.
You know that bit where you were talking about storing food if you skip a meal, is that for people in general or more so with people with PCOS?
More so with polycystic ovary syndrome, because one of the things that they do, because I said that they've got a problem in sensing that they've eaten in the brain, what tends to happen is that they go into starvation mode earlier. And so starvation mode is where you try to not burn off calories and store things. So they'll go. So women who are on a 5-2 diet, for instance, might do really well if they've got problems with their weight and out polycystic ovary syndrome, but perhaps they might not do quite as well with polycystic ovary syndrome.
And have you seen any link between like eating disorders and PCOS?
Yes, there's a huge link between eating disorders, and I think that eating disorders and self-esteem issues are really huge in polycystic ovary syndrome. And that eating disorder is not just bulimia, it's anorexia as well. And eating disorders are very, very common in polycystic ovary syndrome. And another thing, which is probably the most common symptom in polycystic ovary syndrome, is something called sleep apnea. And sleep apnea is where you snore a bit at night, but you don't quite get enough oxygen in, so you keep on waking up. And what that means is people get really tired.
Wow, this is so interesting. I'm just gonna, if there's anyone got any more questions on weight. So is it like an insulin resistance that?
Yeah, I think that women with polycystic ovary syndrome are more likely to be insulin resistant. And what happens is insulin is a hormone that takes the glucose out of your blood and puts it into your fat and puts it into your muscle. But actually, insulin is the other thing that's involved in storing in other ways, and it's also a growth factor, which is what affects the ovary, makes the ovary make more male-type hormones. So insulin, some of the ovary isn't insulin resistant, but the brain is, and perhaps the muscles and that are. So the insulin levels can go, and that's why some women with polycystic ovary syndrome do see a benefit with metformin, and metformin is a drug which is designed to try to make you a little bit more insulin sensitive, and therefore there is some patients that do beneficial. But if I was to give 3 women with polycystic ovary syndrome metformin, one of them would think it was the best thing ever. They'd have more energy, their periods would get better. It doesn't make you lose weight, but if you're on the way down, it can sometimes mean you hit the brick wall a little bit lower. But a third of women would have no benefits with metformin, and a third of women would stop it because the side effects are quite bad with them with regards to bloating and diarrhea and problems with their gastrointestinal system.
And that insulin sensitivity, is that something you can test for?
I mean, it's not commonly tested for, but one of the things that I would probably do is that we do in my practice, we do metabolic tests where we do test for that, but we also test for pre-diabetes as well. And we also look for the fats in the blood, such as the cholesterol and the the lipids in the blood. So we tend to do, the metabolic, testing. So you can test for it. And I would say that in my practice, I probably would diagnose 4 or 5 new cases of diabetes every year on young women with polycystic ovary syndrome. But catching it early, it's good because we can focus on it and deal with it before you run into problems afterwards.
Okay, amazing. So we've talked about weight. Sorry, some people are just saying how helpful it is to talk about this issue. And just in case anyone's interested, I can create a WhatsApp group for everyone who's come tonight to meet and talk about this, because it just seems like you're all getting so much support from chatting, about your symptoms. So yeah, I will be setting that up, sending you an email and a WhatsApp invite. So stay tuned. Can we just go to fertility? What was a relief was to hear that you can get women to produce and release eggs. Is that through giving them hormones or timing contraceptives and stuff like that? Could you just talk through that?
So the answer is no, we tend to use fertility drugs. Okay.
Okay. Give them the drugs.
When it comes down to fertility drugs, we are very, very good. So a woman with polycystic ovary syndrome is no more likely than anybody else to need IVF. In fact, probably a little bit less likely to need IVF. And actually, because women with polycystic ovaries have got all these paused eggs, when you do IVF, instead of growing 8 eggs, which is the average number of eggs to grow in IVF, they might grow 20 or 24. And sometimes that can cause real problems with swelling of the ovaries and causing bloating and fluid leaking into the tummy. And so actually women with polycystic ovary syndrome don't do quite as well at IVF, but the good news is they don't need to have IVF most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're kind of hearing that it's quite your chances of being able to get pregnant are not massively diminished. There is hope.
The biggest thing to see is that if you don't want to get pregnant, you need to use contraception, because you can guarantee, and a lot of women come to see me and say, my doctor told me I wouldn't get pregnant, or I'd struggle to get pregnant. Well, I'm now here because I'm pregnant, I don't want to be. And I think that it's important to remember that. And in Russia, they didn't have fertility drugs for a very, very long time. And what they did was they put a woman on the pill for a short time, then took her off it. And sometimes you got that rebound releasing of an egg, put them back on the pill, took them off it. And so that's why I was talking about how there's a bit of an enhanced fertility after stopping the pill.
Fascinating. Can you just talk a bit about when you're pregnant and you've got PCOS, do you have any does it change your hormones? Does it make pregnancy different?
Okay, so women with polycystic ovary syndrome, in pregnancy, there's no evidence that they'll have any earlier labor or any more likely to have an abnormal baby or run into problems in delivery. So most women with polycystic ovary syndrome will have a totally and utterly healthy pregnancy. A couple of things to say, particularly if there's weight problems, is that there's a diabetes of pregnancy called gestational diabetes, and it's a little bit more common in women with polycystic ovary syndrome. So sometimes they need to have some extra screening to make sure that they haven't developed that. The other thing to say is that pregnancy hormone can stimulate the ovaries, and occasionally women's skin can get a little bit worse at the beginning of pregnancy, because it's at the beginning of pregnancy that the pregnancy hormone is at its highest.
Are any types of contraceptives better for treating the symptoms or managing PCOS than others? Okay,
so I do think that the pill is better than the mini pill, but there's some women who are not suitable for the pill. Okay, mm-hmm. So I think that the pill's more suitable than the mini pill. Any combined contraceptive pill will work. There are some pills that might be slightly better. Now, we know that when it comes down to the pill, and I'm sure you in the Lowdown have talked a lot about this, is the fact that there was a pill scare about the level of blood clots in women taking the pill. And it seemed to be that the more modern pills are a little bit worse than the old-fashioned pills. And it tended to be related not to the estrogen in the pill, which is the hormone that's associated with blood clots, but the other part of the pill, which called the progestogen part of the pill. And it seemed to be that if you had a really strong progestogen, then it dominated the estrogen, and therefore the blood clot risk was less. But the strong progestogens are the old-fashioned ones, which are derivatives of male type hormones. So paradoxically, the more modern pills, the ones that people worry a little bit more about, might be slightly better in PCOS. But they tend to be the slight ones that are a little bit more expensive, and people, you know, like Yasmin or Esme and things like that, people sometimes find it more challenging to get access to that. Okay.
Oh, yeah, Dr. Fran's just jumping in. Yeah, Lucette, Yasmin, yeah, that like group of slightly more modern pills.
Yeah, and I think that there's the interesting thing is that there's a pill called Dianet or Claret, which has got male hormone blocker in it as well. Now the pill will switch off the ovaries' male type hormones, but half of a woman's male hormones come from the adrenal gland, and you can't switch off the adrenal gland. And sometimes in PCOS that's enough to keep that little extra hair going. And so sometimes, you know, just being on the pill doesn't help, and you need to sort of have a male hormone blocker as well. Now, the thing about the male hormone blockers is it can affect libido, and that's something we need to talk about. But when it comes down to male hormone blockers, there's a pill called Claret or Dianet, which has got a male hormone blocker in it, and often that women will find that very beneficial. But GPs think of it as a very, very bad pill because that was one of the ones with a higher level of blood clots. It doesn't quite make sense because the gestogen in it is a very strong one. And therefore we know that it shouldn't be one of the really bad ones. And I think that probably it's an okay pill that tends to not be given to young, slim, sort of normal sort of women who are on the pill all the time. It tends to be given to older women who've got polycystic ovary syndrome and perhaps weight problems, who are slightly more likely to get clots anyway. So I think it's probably an okay pill given to a slightly higher risk rather than anything else. But it is a pill that people will struggle to get put on because people are anxious about it.
Yeah. And if you can't take the combined pill, what would you recommend?
Okay, well, I mean, I think that when it comes down to it, the mini pill is okay, and the more modern mini pills like Cerazette might be a little bit better because they dampen down the ovaries a little bit much, but they're not as good for the skin. They will stop your periods. You won't have to worry about having no periods with regards to that, but it's not quite as good for the skin. There are some patients that can't take the pill, but I add in a little bit of extra male hormone blocker to the mini pill, but that tends to be something that GPs wouldn't be comfortable about doing, and you'd have to see one of the reproductive endocrinologists to access something like that.
We haven't really talked about hair growth. Just quickly on what PCOS might do to your hair.
Okay, so one of the things about sort of hair is that all over your body, you know, you've got these tiny little hairs, and these are called vellus hairs. And if you spray yourself with deodorant, you'll see little hairs, you know, all the time. And if you see a little bit extra male type hormone, what happens is these hairs get a bit thicker and more noticeable, and that's called terminal hair. Now, the drugs that are designed to treat hair, they don't make hair fall out. What they're designing to do is trying to take that thicker hair and make it thinner again and less noticeable. And they can do that, but what happens is it takes months and months and months and months before you notice any difference at all. And it tends to affect the smaller hairs before it affects the hairs that are bothering you the most. And so I would say that if I put somebody on some big, powerful male hormone blocking drugs for their extra hair, then after 6 months, they say, I don't see any difference. After a year, they'll see a bit of a difference. And it's probably about 2 years before you can see that maximal effect, and then you can go into more maintenance therapy. I mean, laser treatment can be beneficial, but a lot of access in the NHS can be very challenging.
So what can a woman do if she's got a lot of beardy chin hairs? Is it really just going on drugs?
I think the answer is that there are hormone solutions, but these hormone solutions are in the longer term. Okay? Yeah. And so therefore, I think the solution has to be cosmetic. There is a cream that's a prescription cream, which it doesn't make hair fall out, but what it does is it blocks the building blocks of hair. And these building blocks of hair, if you block them, the hair will get thinner. And actually, some women, they find that works well for them. The problem with that is the building blocks of hair are the same as the building blocks of skin. And so some women, particularly with sensitive skin, find that it irritates their skin and they can't use it. And a lot of women use cosmetic solutions. Now, people will say to me, if I shave, my hair is going to get worse. And that's not true. What happens is that imagine if you go out to your garden and you've planted a little tree and you stumble into it, and that tree will just give way to you, it will flop over because of that. But if you saw it off, 6 inches above the ground and you stumble into it, you'll really hurt yourself because it will not give. And that's the main reason. You'll notice it more if it's shorter. But no, it doesn't make your hair coming back. If you shave, it doesn't make your hair come back more. It just makes it more noticeable when it's at that smaller, stubblier stage.
What was the name of that cream?
It's called Venica.
Venica. Okay.
Veniqua.
Cool. Any more questions from anyone in the chat before we wrap up? I've tried to sort of cover most of the main areas that have come up. Anything else that I guess women can do in terms of lifestyle or non-hormonal therapies or things like that, Colin, that you'd recommend?
Well, I mean, so one of the things that's coming up a bit recently is whether or not there's some dietary supplementation that can help, and different things work better for different women. And I'll have women that come to see me, I'll say, I've taken this from the health food shop and I do feel better, and taking it from there. There's not a lot of really good research from it, but one of the things that's coming up a little bit more these days is something called inositol or myo-inositol, which is designed to sort of help with metabolism a little. And there are some patients that do benefit from it, but again, we don't have the degree of research to do that. But that's not a prescription-based drug, that's a supplement, health food supplement.
Is that what is it? What is inositol?
It's a type of molecule that's involved in metabolism.
Okay. I'm going to wrap this up, I think. I have absolutely loved tonight. I think it's been really, really, really interesting. So thank you so much, Colin. As so many of you were interested in speaking to each other and continuing the conversation, I'll email you all tomorrow with a link to this recording, key takeouts, and a link to join a WhatsApp group. Yeah, getting loads of thanks in the chat. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope that was helpful. Great, thanks, Colin.
Okay, thanks very much.
Really, really good research. So do you think it is is your hypothesis that it is potentially an exposure to male hormones?
I think that the fact that if you look at women who have experiments of nature, so for instance, they develop an androgen, say a male hormone secreting tumor during pregnancy, then you can see the effects in humans as well. Now, we know that the placenta tries to protect the pregnancy from male-type hormones, and so therefore you can have a lot of male-type hormones in the mother, but the placenta protects the fetus from male-type hormones. So it's difficult to know, but I think it must tell us something about it. The fact that in multiple different species, if you were to just briefly raise the male-type hormone exposure of the female fetus, there is a lot of changes that relate to PCOS. And if you look at male equivalents of PCOS, it's quite interesting. There's a bit of research being done on that just now. You can see the same thing. And so I do think that whatever the cause of it is that one of the pathways is probably male hormone signaling before you're born.
Wow. That is so interesting. Yeah. Do you think the number of women having this has increased, or it's just our ability to diagnose them?
I think it's increasing, and I think it probably is increasing as people gradually gain weight, and we know that the population is increasing, of increased weight is increasing, and I think that means it's becoming more noticeable. Amazing. Thanks so much. Yeah, I will end this now and share the recording and send out details of the WhatsApp chat. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye.